Imagine standing at the edge of history, looking down into a dark pit where human ingenuity was used for the most terrifying purpose possible. We like to think of ourselves as civilized, but for thousands of years, the brightest minds in the world weren't just figuring out how to build cathedrals or sail oceans, they were designing the perfect exit. From the scorching deserts of Persia to the high-tech chambers of modern America, the goal has often been the same: to turn the end of a life into a message. Today, we're going beyond the history books. We're performing a 10-minute deep dive into the mechanics, the science, and the sheer psychological horror of how every major execution method in history actually works. If you think you have a strong stomach, stay tuned, because it only gets more intense from here. Let's start with a method so legendary for its cruelty that historians still debate if it was even real, or just a terrifying piece of propaganda. It's called scaphism, also known as the boats. Originating in ancient Persia, this wasn't just about ending a life. It was about creating a living ecosystem of decay. The person was sandwiched between two narrow rowboats with only their head and limbs poking out. They weren't starved, quite the opposite. They were force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until their body physically revolted. Then that same honey was smeared over their face and eyes. Left under the blistering sun on a stagnant pond, the sweetness attracted every insect for miles. Over the course of days or even weeks, the person would literally be consumed from the inside out by swarms. It's a slow, agonizing process of infection and dehydration that could last over 2 weeks. It was the ultimate psychological deterrent because it took the concept of returning to the earth and turned it into a waking nightmare. Moving from the water to the fire, we find the brazen bull of ancient Sicily. This is perhaps the most designed device on our list. Imagine a massive hollow bronze statue of a bull. A door would open, the person would be placed inside, and a massive fire would be lit underneath. As the metal began to glow, the temperature inside would climb to lethal levels. But here is the truly twisted part. The inventor, a man named Paralyze, installed a series of complex internal pipes and whistles in the bull's nose. As the person inside screamed, the acoustic system would transform those cries of agony into the deep, rhythmic bellowing of a frustrated bull. Smoke and steam would billow from the nostrils, making it look like the statue was coming to life. It turned a horrific event into a public performance. Irony hit the inventor hard, though, as he was the first person the tyrant Phalaris tested it on. Now, let's head north to the Vikings. You've probably heard of the blood eagle from shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom. The description is cinematic. The person's back is opened. Their ribs are detached from the spine and pulled outward to look like wings, and their lungs are pulled out to rest on their shoulders. It was supposedly a ritual for Odin. Modern science has stepped in to give us a reality check. A 2022 anatomical study concluded that while this could be done, the person would lose consciousness and die within seconds due to the massive drop in blood pressure and the collapse of the respiratory system. The idea of someone enduring it while alive is likely more Norse poetry than medical reality. It shows us that sometimes the legend of the method is designed to be more frightening than the act itself. But while the Vikings may have been about symbolic rituals, Imperial China was about the science of duration. For nearly 1,000 years, they practiced linki, or the death by 1,000 cuts. This was reserved for the most serious crimes against the state. The executioner's goal was a paradox. They had to systematically remove parts of the body, while keeping the person alive for as long as possible. In some eras, this meant 100 cuts. In others, it was over 3,000. It was a grisly display of precision. The psychology here wasn't just the panic, was the public shame and the idea that the body would be incomplete in the afterlife. It wasn't abolished until 1905, making it one of the longest-running forms of systematic execution in human history. Back in England, the Crown had its own specialty for those who dared to commit treason, being hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was a multi-stage event designed to destroy the person in every way possible. First, they were dragged through the streets. That's the drawn part to ensure the public saw their face. Then they were hanged, but the executioner would cut the rope while they were still gasping for air. While conscious, they would endure the removal of their internal organs, which were burned right in front of them. Finally, the body was divided into 4 parts and sent to the 4 corners of the kingdom. It was a literal map of the king's power. If you walked across London Bridge in the 14th century, you wouldn't see a view. You'd see a row of heads on spikes, a constant reminder of the price of rebellion. And finally, for this first half of our journey, we look at the breaking wheel. Used across Europe, this was a favorite for highwaymen and murderers. The person was tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner would use a heavy iron bar to systematically break every major bone in their limbs. To make it effective, they would place wooden blocks under the joints so the bone would snap. Cleanly, once the person was essentially a collection of shattered limbs, they were woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted into the air on a pole. They were left there for the birds and the elements. It's a death that came not from a single blow, but from the slow failure of the body to handle the trauma and dehydration. These ancient and medieval methods all shared one thing: they were meant to be seen. They were public theater. But as we move into the modern era, the methods changed. They became cleaner, faster, and more humane, at least that's what we were told. In part 2, we're going to look at the terrifying reality of botched electric chairs, the hidden failures of lethal injection, and the extreme methods still used by regimes today. As the world moved out of the Middle Ages, the goal of execution shifted. It was no longer about public spectacle and theatrical suffering. The focus turned toward efficiency and what was perceived as humanity. But, as we're about to see, when you try to turn the end of a life into a mechanical or chemical process, the margin for error becomes terrifyingly thin. Take the practice of death by sawing. Used from ancient Rome to the 18th century, this was a bridge between the old world and the new. To maximize the time a person remained aware, they were hung upside down. This kept the blood flowing to the brain, preventing them from passing out from the shock. The executioners would then use a massive Tumen saw to move through the body vertically. Because they started from the bottom and moved upward, the vital organs in the chest remained intact until the very end. Records from Morocco in 1705 describe victims who were still conscious and able to speak even after the process was halfway complete. It was a cold, methodical use of gravity and biology to extend the moment of passing. Then there's flaying, the systematic removal of the skin. While this sounds like something out of a horror movie, it was a very real tool of state control. In ancient Assyria, and even in parts of medieval Europe, the skin is the body's largest organ, responsible for regulating temperature and keeping out infection. Removing it doesn't kill instantly. Instead, it triggers a slow descent into hypothermia and dehydration. In 1571, the Venetian commander Marco Antonio Bragadin was subjected to this by Ottoman forces. His skin was eventually stuffed and displayed as a trophy. When his tomb was opened centuries later, in 1961, historians found the preserved remains, proving that the accounts of this grueling process were not just wartime exaggeration, but a documented reality. But as we entered the 20th century, we wanted something cleaner. Enter the electric chair. First used in 1890, it was marketed as a high-tech, instant alternative to the clumsiness of hanging. The science seems simple. Send enough voltage through the body to stop the heart and brain simultaneously. But the reality has been anything but simple. When the equipment fails due to a bad wire, a dry sponge, or an incorrect voltage setting, the result is catastrophic. In 1983, a man named John Evans had to endure 3 separate jolts of electricity. Over 14 minutes, witnesses reported smoke and flames coming from his body while he was still alive. These botched executions revealed the dark side of modern technology. When the machine fails, the humane method becomes a prolonged ordeal of fire and internal trauma. While Western methods shifted toward chemicals, other nations leaned into high-caliber force. In North Korea, anti-aircraft guns are used for point-blank executions, designed to instantly obliterate the target as a display of total state erasure. Historically, South Asia utilized trained elephants, capable of either ending a life instantly or inflicting methodical, controlled trauma at a ruler's command. From Persian ponds to modern injection rooms, the history of execution mirrors human society's evolution from public theater to clinical science. Whether through bronze, blades, or bolts, humanity has spent millennia perfecting the art of the end. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's mysteries.